So, Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, being impeached. I still don't really fully understand what the allegations of the impeachment are. I understand in broad strokes he's accused of having taken bribes from a well-connected millionaire for the political purposes in 2020. Then, when some of his employees were looking into it and said we should go after Paxton criminally or whatever, he then fires. I think that's it. He fires the whistleblowers, and then they end up settling their lawsuit for a payment of $3 million, which already looks bad for Paxton. And you're going to have to tell me why this doesn't look as bad as it looks. And then Paxton says the taxpayers should pay that. And they say, no, if the taxpayers pay that, that's some sort of fraud and it should be you. But I'm not sure that I understand what he's being impeached for. And if I've misunderstood something of that timeline, Robert, and why this is only coming out, I don't know, what are we, 2023, when this is alleged to have occurred in 2020?
Well, large portions of it have already come out before, and the voters knew about it and reelected Paxton in 2022. So, the short answer is there was no bribery. Paxton has been a target of the Bush Republican establishment in Texas going way back. The Bush political establishment is very strong in Texas, despite the fact there's no Bush elected anymore in Texas. Poppy Bush pretended to be a Texan when he moved from Connecticut. He partially got away with it. Kevin Phillips made fun of him, called him Poppy the Populist, talking about how absurd that was with his, middle America experience and just traveling across America. He wasn't the pedigree. He wasn't the scion of some wealthy, rich, powerful, old money, warmongering, war-whoring family from the Northeast. No, of course not. He was just a oil catter from Texas, wild catter from Texas. And then W really, aced it by growing up in Texas and pretending to be like a Texas Ranger and a good old boy, and he could wear a cowboy hat. And he wouldn't know an oil cat he couldn't be a wildcatter to save his life. I mean, he did try a little bit at the oil business, but the legitimate part he failed at, like everything else a Bush does. But their friends and allies fill the Texas Supreme Court, fill the Texas appeals courts, fill the higher ranks of Texas bureaucracy, still fill large parts of the Texas legislature. So they're used to running the state lock, stock, and barrel. And along comes Ken Paxton, gets elected Attorney General of the state, becomes a strong populist advocate, allies himself with Trump. He took the lead in the 2020 election, challenging what took place up to the United States Supreme Court. Took the lead on a range of censorship and social media issues, took the lead on trans treatment and other issues, took the lead on immigration issues, took the lead on Obamacare issues. These were issues the Bushites in Texas were deeply dissatisfied with, but couldn't tell anybody in Texas they were. Not to mention all the way they're deeply embedded within old oil money in Texas. Old oil money goes all the way back to, you might say, the assassination of a Kennedy. That's who these people are. And so they've been coming after Paxton in waves. First, they tried to set him up on bogus federal, and all related to, there's a buddy of his. There was a donor and a supporter, but it's more significant that it was a friend of his. A friend of his gets targeted by the feds. He goes to Paxton and says, these federal agents they're making stuff up. They're lying in affidavits. They're expanding it illicitly.
They would never do that. Robert,
they're post-changing it. He goes, they file one affidavit and then they change it later and they make it pretend they did a different affidavit earlier than they really did, just so they could do a bogus execution of a warrant. He goes, aren't you the Attorney General of Texas? Are you going to investigate this violation of law in Texas or not? So Paxton says, okay, I'll take a look at it. He assigns a Texas Ranger to it, assigns other attorneys to investigate. The Texas Ranger is, a good old boy, knows how to get up there and BS with a bunch of them. He's like a lot of your Texas Rangers, fakes, phonies, and frauds in my experience. I'm not a big fan of the Texas Rangers I've met in my life. I'm sure there's plenty of good, decent ones. I'm sure a few are watching. But most of my experience with Texas Rangers has been negative. They tend to be what they were born to be, which was a lot. You go dig into the history of what Texas Rangers were really about and from their founding days. But this guy fits right into that tradition. He pretends he's helping investigate to Paxton while secretly undermining the case. He's like, I'm not going to help this guy. The good FBI is investigating. This dimwit testifies he couldn't imagine anything being wrong with the good FBI, just like he couldn't imagine anything being wrong with the good Texas Rangers. And so he has no grounds to it. He just speculates there must be something wrong as to why we're investigating the mighty holy FBI. And the two other attorneys are the same way. They accuse the attorney general of taking a bribe. He never took a bribe. There's no evidence of it all. All you have is a guy openly, publicly, and transparently investigating alleged illegal behavior by the federal government on a Texan, period. End of story. The guy happened to be a friend, so he got access to the attorney general, but there's no illegal nature of that. And so these two guys try to stage a coup, and he's like, screw that, you're gone. I'm going to hire somebody else. They get free legal representation for years from, shock, key Bush family allies. What a total shock that is. And these frauds of so-called fake whistleblowers file suit in Austin, where we know from the Alex Jones case how much justice you can get in Austin. So Ken Paxton's lawyers tell him, just settle, pay it off, move on down the road. And Paxton's like, this is ridiculous. The whole thing is ludicrous. But in the state of Texas should have to pay for this nonsense because they're the key Texas state participants, including the lieutenant governor, are neck deep in all this nonsense. Dan Patrick should be ashamed of himself. So should Governor Abbott for not doing better action before now. And letting this get way out of hand by the incompetent drunks that usually run the Texas legislature, which sadly is bipartisan. When it comes to drunkery and debauchery in the Texas legislature, that is a bipartisan tradition.
But Robert, it's not like Paxton would have $3.1 million to pay off as a settlement of his own personal funds, or is he that? No,
wealthy? There's probably insurance proceeds available, but he probably assumed that he was being really sued in his state official duties. Yeah. So frankly, it should be covered by state insurance. And the state of Texas didn't want it because it was all part of a setup. So they run to the Texas House. They do a 48-hour impeachment. They don't investigate anything. A bunch of political hacks. Every person who voted for this impeachment should be thrown out. They get away with it because the ordinary person doesn't have time to focus on these kind of things. And the people that do are on the wrong side. The Texas Senate should clearly acquit him after the embarrassing record in the testimony. Like everybody that was anti-Paxton thought they were going to hear smoking gun testimony. They were going to hear how he secret meetings and bribes and threats. None of that. None of it. They had no grounds for what they claimed from the beginning. They had no idea. They just made it up. Paxton is completely innocent. And here they're trying to railroad it's Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, Republican lieutenant governor, trying to railroad the Republican attorney general because he actually keeps his word to his voters, not unlike a certain presidential candidate.
I was listening to some of the analysis. I paid attention. It's too much for me to even know where to begin in terms of understanding this. He's been removed from office right now during this trial, correct?
Yes. Conveniently, right after he announced he was going to investigate Pfizer. Remember DeSantis, who promised to open up a grand jury in Florida? Where is that? I guess he's too busy going to Iowa State games and nobody knowing who the hell he is. I haven't heard boo from that grand jury in Florida. But Paxton announced his own office was going to open up one. And a week later, they're rushing through this action because most of the Republicans in the Texas legislature are corrupt. They should be impeached and removed themselves. I think the speaker, one of the lead ones, is like so drunk. It's like a common thing. You want to crack up and watch some humor. You tune in and watch the Texas House operating, and he'll be about 1 in 2 chance he'll be drunk talking from the thing. This is embarrassing to say to Texas. But instead, they're trying to derail the only populist that's done anything worth the darn in Texas. Because the 2 senators, including Cruz, have been mostly useless. Cruz occasionally does something useful, and then he'll disappear for a long period of time. And then the other senator, who follows me on Twitter, has been mostly a lame-o. Senator John Corbett, I think. But the Governor Abbott occasionally does something useful. But this is ridiculous. This is the guy getting impeached? Well, Kevin McCarthy can't figure out whether he can impeach Joe Biden or Merrick Garland or Lisa Monaco or the FBI Director Wray. What an embarrassment to the Republican Party. What a disgrace. Just like their inability to come to the rallying in the defense of Peter Navarro.
Well, hold on. I had one clip before we get there. I think this is the speaker who is accused of
he was drunk all the time.
to not be able to handle your liquor is the bigger sin. I mean,
You're right. I mean, Texas, how drunk do you have to be?
The speaker, I'll move adoption.
There we go. This is the guy. I think this is what I was.
Mr. Campbell, send an amendment is acceptable to the author. Is there objection to the opposite
It's
amendment?
so bad, Robert. You would think the man is mentally
And this is
challenged.
the guy orchestrating the impeachment of Attorney
amendment
General
is acceptable to
Paxton.
the author. Is there objection to the opposite amendment? The chair has none. Amendment is
You
adopted.
see his buddies trying to say, hey,
I don't think I've ever been that drunk. Maybe once I've been that drunk, but I like to think that even when I'm absolutely hammered, I may not know that I'm speaking properly, but I am. That's it. Okay.
yeah,
But
that's
Robert,
how
he's-
embarrassing it is.
But
And
he's good. He's
it's
going to
going
get.
along because that's what the Bush Republican Party looks like, folks. That's what it looks like. The Texas speaker drunk off his ass, just like old George W. liked to get right down there. And it's the problem with the Republican Party. It's why Peter Navarro was left out to dry in that crazy another Bannon-like contempt trial, where this is somebody who's only on trial because he asserted executive privilege, which was his right. The court refused to recognize the executive privilege. The Biden Justice Department corruptly refused to enforce it. And it was all because of the January 6th committee, which was busy destroying evidence that could relate to his acquittals. And he was in front of a D.C. grand jury, then a D.C. jury, which meant guaranteed conviction. Emerson poll proved that 92% of D.C. people could not commit to the presumption of innocence. 92% in any Trump-connected case. And the conviction of him was purely for a show trial purpose that now he has to appeal.
Well, and so I mean, this is the same thing as Bannon. He gets the subpoena from Congress, says I have executive privilege, and they say no. Are we dealing with the same type of him having been stripped of his defenses, his affirmative defenses before the trial by
the judge ruled that he couldn't defend himself on a reliance defense. He couldn't say they relied on counsel. He couldn't say he relied on executive privilege, and he couldn't rely on those as objective defenses as to whether executive privilege applied or not. Which, by the way, was the point and purpose of these contempt statutes, was that you could test the contempt with executive privilege or any other privilege you asserted. And these courts in D.C. are eviscerating that because he's an enemy of the political apparatus, enemy of the uniparty, just like Ken Paxton, just like Donald Trump, just like Steve Bannon. And that's why they're railroading him in things that make our criminal proceedings. Again, our criminal justice process is making the Stasi and the Soviet system look like beacons of integrity and transparency.
And Robert, it's the same penalty as Bannon for contempt. It's like a year in jail and $250,000 per infraction. So
it's something along those lines. I presume he'll get bail pending appeal. I assume the judge won't be that bankrupt of moral virtue to go that any further. You never know with DC these days.